Es un gusto estar con Johan Norberg, un reconocido autor sueco que ha producido varios libros a nivel internacional discutiendo temas tan fascinantes como la globalización, el progreso, digamos, las claves del éxito en términos de crecimiento económico, de construir sociedades más exitosas y de mejor bienestar y calidad humana. Johan nos visita a raíz del lanzamiento del informe de competitividad de este año y para nosotros, Corte Colombiana, es un gusto tenerlo como invitado especial después de esta plenaria que nos ha dado en este lanzamiento, darle la bienvenida a nuestro país. Johan, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
My pleasure.
So I would like to start the conversation by discussing globalization. You have written extensively about globalization, and we know that in the last few years we have experienced a series of shocks like the trade war between China and the US, COVID-19, now the war in Ukraine. And there is this discussion whether globalization has already peaked. What are the prospects of global trends going forward? Are we going to see a very different world in the next few decades from what we have experienced in recent years? So I would like to start from that big theme of globalization, and then we can move towards more concrete topics.
Yeah. Well, I hope it's not the end of globalization, because it has really been important in spreading new ideas and technology around the world, and thereby unleashing lots of growth and poverty reduction. Some 130,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day for the last 20 years, partly because globalization of technology and of business has raised productivity and opportunity. And I don't think it's the end of globalization, because we have heard this before. You know, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in the United States was supposed to end globalization. Then it was the global financial crisis in 2008 would end globalization. Then it was Brexit and Donald Trump and the rise of populism. Then it was the pandemic, and then it was the war in Ukraine. And for some weird reason, trade keeps bouncing back, because it's built on opportunity and of millions of people finding a better way of doing things when they can collaborate and exchange with others. Some things are changing. I think there is a real decoupling going on between the United States and China, primarily, but that also opens up a space for other players. Most of the reduction in EU imports from China to the United States has been made up by imports from Vietnam and from India. And there's also a growth of globalization when it comes to ideas, services, management, all the things that we can build upon digital communications technology. And that's interesting, because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, I think, in improving the way we do services, in the way we're building infrastructure, providing local services, financial services, and management. So some parts of globalization will decline, some sort of manufacturing perhaps, but services will increase.
Okay, that's interesting, because in our country we have been trying to open up to trade and to integrate with the rest of the world in the 90s, but the progress has been very sluggish, very slow. And perhaps this new aspect of globalization, with the decoupling of trade between China and the US, will open up new doors for a country like Colombia that eventually could dream, why not, to replace some of the trade that is coming from Asia. What do you think about this prospect? Is something that it could be done, or we should think on something else along a different line?
No, you shouldn't. I mean, this is a perfect opportunity. There's lots of space opening up right now, with businesses and consumers looking for new suppliers and new trade partners in so many places. And Colombia is close to very large markets. There's excellent opportunity out there, provided that we also have a regulatory setting which doesn't sort of introduce protectionism from the back door, making it very difficult to make sure that the same goods and services can be bought and sold in various places. also making sure that Colombia has the right infrastructure to make sure that workers and goods and the digital communication can make it through to other places as well. This is the opportunity to do it.
Okay. One of the things that have been around in the current discussion in Colombia is that there is a little bit of the fatigue about this type of narratives, because in one way the country open to trade, but at the same time it maintain a lot of non-tariff barriers. So it has been it has been this discussion of whether we have been profiting from globalization, from trade, and even in some part of the political discourse there is this narrative that we need to renegotiate trade agreements, that we need to focus more on the domestic market. But at the same time, we haven't actually proved or going to the water of really opening up the economy. How to reconcile these things, how to move forward in this type of discussions when thinking about taking these opportunities that are to grasp right now.
Yeah, I understand why people become fed up when they've been promised a lot of things and nothing much happens, despite the prominent top world leader meetings and signing of all the documents. I think the problem is that we have focused too much on just sort of the tariff rates and quotas, whereas now most of the protectionism is really coming back through the back door in various regulations that are tailor-made to local businesses, which makes it incredibly hard for countries with another set of regulations to compete and to get their goods and services across the border. And that's why I think we need to, I don't know if we have to open up the old trade agreements. Perhaps we need more trade agreements that keep the old gains, but now begin to focus minds on these local rules and regulations that are in fact barriers to trade.
From here, I would like to jump into perhaps a broader theme, which is we have been discussing trade, but you have written also extensively about growth and the key aspect to success as a country, as a society. And you have mentioned, and you mentioned on the lecture here, that one of the key aspects of this process is to give people the opportunity to integrate, to participate. Can you tell us a little bit more about what have you learned about what could be this key aspect of successful stories in terms of economic growth and welfare in society?
Yeah. Well, I think of economic progress in the same way as I think of the World Cup. How do you end up successful at the World Cup? And I really hope Colombia will do better the next time around, as will Sweden, hopefully. We didn't make it this year around. Because there are some people who think that the best way to create a World Cup success is to just find the best coach, an expensive coach, and hire him, or in Colombia's case, just hiring and firing them constantly while finding another one. And I think the key is something else. It is to give every kid a ball and make sure that they can play and experiment and come up with new ideas, and then we'll find talent in strange places, and they will do things that surprise us, and some will go on to the most well-paid leagues and learn the best tricks from over there and come back and improve the game over here, and we'll also have larger pools of coaches to pick from. I think it's the same thing with the economy. We can't think about the economy top down and try to point to exactly the one player, that business or that sector will grow if we give them these benefits. We have to open up to experiments, because all great business models, all amazing innovations have been the results of allowing ourselves to be surprised by the experiment of millions of people. And that has to be done in close coordination with the market, because all the knowledge cannot be centralized. It's out there in millions of people who try to use the new technologies and goods and services from their own vantage point. And they then come up with feedback and pushback, and the business has to adapt and tweak the results of that. That's how you create success in the end. It takes a long while and lots of trial and error, lots of failure. But failure isn't really failure. Failure is the way to begin again in a more intelligent way, because you've learned something along the way. And that's what I think we have to learn. We can't plan for success, but we can open up for experiments and exchange, and that will get us there.
Okay, this is very interesting because, and here I want to touch bases with a little bit of your lecture when you discuss Sweden and the economic history, and broadly speaking, the history of your country, because the perception for many of us that are not that familiar with Sweden is that Sweden is a successful country because of planification, because of regulation, because of a mix between planning and markets. So I would like perhaps for you to give us a little bit of your view or your analysis on how Sweden became a relatively successful country that has become almost like a benchmark for many other countries. How you got there, and what's next, and how you can continue to improve.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, because you really have to update your perceptions of Sweden, as do most people, because it's still stuck in the 1970s and 80s Sweden. That's not really what Sweden is about. To start, and to make a long story short, Sweden got successful after a 100-year period, basically, of very open markets and a very limited government that allowed for lots of creativity in the private market, building multinational companies that provided us with massive resources. And as early as the 1950s, Sweden was already, the third richest country on the planet, after having been one of the poorest in Europe in the late 19th century. And that was built on this openness. And that was also remained in place under the Social Democrats, who ruled for most of the 20th century. Because they realized that, yes, we want to redistribute resources, we want to provide people with services and with a safety net, but those resources has to come from a successful private sector working in an open world economy. So they always protected property rights, price system, and free trade, and that made us successful. Then the period that a lot of people think about when they think of Sweden is what we did in the 1970s and 80s, because that was a period when people started to be fed up with doing things in this long-termish way. There was this sense of raised expectation. People wanted everything at once, and that forced the Social Democratic government to begin to grow the size of government dramatically, doubling the size of government in 20 years. Taxes and regulations shot up, trying to sort of solve all the problems instantly from the top down. And this is what people remember, that we did that. We almost experimented with socialist ideas, and yet we were a fairly successful, rich economy. But it's like that old joke, how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune and then you waste lots of it. And that's what happened. We were so rich in Sweden so that we began to experiment with these ideas, and that almost destroyed us, because many of the big companies, they left Sweden. Companies like Tetra Pak and IKEA left Sweden because it was impossible to do business under these circumstances. And we didn't get new companies doing it. And for 30 years, we didn't create a single net job in the private sector. So it was a horrible era, seen from the Swedish perspective. And it ended in a terrible financial crisis in the early 1990s, because then the macroeconomic situation in the world shifted, kind of like it does right now. Suddenly interest rates shoot up and people are beginning to be a little bit more cautious about whom do they lend to. So basically they avoided Sweden, and we had an exchange rate crisis, and for a moment in time the Swedish central bank actually increased its interest rate to 500% to protect the Swedish currency. So obviously this was a terrible failure. And at that point, from the left to the right, there was a consensus, we're going to have to go back to the previous recipe that made us rich in the first place. And that's what we've been working on in the past 20, 30 years, trying to open up new markets again, reducing the size of government, making taxes a little bit less harmful to businesses, and opening up for private providers in the public sector. And that has gotten us back to, once again, outperforming our neighbors and being a bit of a success story again. But as you hear, it's not the kind of Sweden that most people think of. It's more of an open free market system with a generous welfare state.
Great. Just to conclude, because I know that you need to rush to the airport, and thank you again for your time. After revisiting the history of Sweden with creation of wealth, and then the 20 period for redistribution, a country like Colombia that's still very long way to go in terms of wealth and in terms of prosperity, what would be perhaps your messages or your key aspects from us to learn from that process? What would be your recommendations?
My recommendation would be, don't lose your patience with what happens when every kid gets a ball, because that won't make you a world champion next year or in the next World Cup. But it will create a system whereby you see an increase in learning, in creativity and innovation that will make you a much better football team 10, 20 years from now. It's exactly the same thing with growth and entrepreneurship. Don't lose your patience with the experiments that have to take time, because it's based on learning, it's based on feedback and adaptation. It takes a lot of time. You won't get this kind of simple message that I can fix all your problems straight away. You can't. It has to be dependent on exploiting all that knowledge and all that creativity from different places. And then in the long run, it will make all the difference. Because if you can raise your growth rate to 3% per capita, it means that you've doubled national income in a bit more than 20 years. Now imagine what you can do with those resources. In contrast, trying to sort of get certain groups a little bit more now and take from another group right now, the thing that we deal with in politics is actually kind of futile compared to this enormous long-term increase in all our living standards. If we just sort of keep our eyes on the ball and don't fall for the temptation to just pretend that we can fix everything with some sort of magical formula from the top.
Perfect. Thank you so much. To end up with this optimistic note about betting on the future, and I hope next time we can be discussing how Sweden and Colombia qualify to the World Cup, perhaps the next time around. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.